Right, okay, thank you very much for agreeing to talk to me. I've got a few questions. So just to introduce you, first of all, I think most people will be familiar with your name as a teacher and researcher, but especially in vocabulary. Mm-hmm. So the first question, kind of simple, but how did you start off in the field, and what led you to focus on vocabulary?
Well, my teachers were people who taught in India, and there was a very long tradition in India, including Michael West, I guess, way back in the 1930s and so on, in the colonial service, who'd begun really pioneering work on vocab, and I think they were largely in that tradition. And so I think the influence of my teachers were really my inspiration to keep working and start working in vocabulary.
Mm-hmm. Well, maybe 30 years ago, vocabulary was a little bit more neglected, would you say?
Yeah, people talk about a neglect of vocabulary around the 1980s and so on, and I'm sure there was at that time. I started doing a big review of vocabulary studies, and I thought I'd probably find about, or maybe 10 or 20 or 30. And it really surprised me, though, that when I looked right back to the end of the previous century, around the 1890s, right up until just before the 1980s when I was doing this work, I actually found a lot of studies, but people generally didn't know about them. But even so, there wasn't very much research on vocabulary going on. Now the situation's changed enormously. I review articles for journals sometimes, and the number I get, or requests get to review articles on vocabulary is it's almost overwhelming now.
Well, that leads on to the next question, because there does seem to be an awful lot of research into vocabulary nowadays, but do you think it is translating into what teachers are doing in the classroom? That's
always a big problem, because there's always a gap, I think, between the research and the application of that research. And I think I've seen that one of the jobs I'd really like to do is to try and bridge that gap between the research and its application, because I think if it doesn't get applied, then there's not a lot of point in doing the research. But having said that, I can see changes in course books and things like that, which I think do reflect what we know about vocabulary. And so I see that research is, I think, getting into course book design.
Actually, that was, again, I'd like to ask about course books. Do you think, how are textbooks improving?
Well, one of the most obvious ways for me is that people have an awareness of vocabulary levels, I think, that they realise that there's high frequency vocabulary and low frequency vocabulary, and I think there's probably better vocabulary control going on. I also see an enormous increase in the number of extensive readers or graded readers, and Japan, I think, is very influential in this, because a lot of people are doing very innovative extensive reading programs in Japan. Another way I see an improvement in the textbooks is that there's research on interference, about how you group words together to make learning better. And I see in textbooks that there used to be you could find lots of examples of words which were interfering with each other, being more difficult to learn because they were introduced with others which were too closely related. I see much less of that nowadays. So I think it's probably also reflecting that the profession is becoming more professionalised. A lot of teachers who are language teachers now go and have training, and they do master's degrees, in some cases doctorate degrees, and even certificates and diplomas in language teaching. So they're better informed than previous generations were, I think.
You mentioned the high and low frequency words, and because of kind of the explosion of the computer-generated corpora and things like that, or calculated corporas, we know a lot more about those now. How has this affected?
Well, we know a lot and we don't know a lot. It's still really hard to find good modern word lists, and it's a case of where the more we know, the more we realise how difficult it is to do this job properly. And there's still a lot of research that needs to be done into how word lists are made and the nature of word lists and so on. And some of that research is being done, but it's always been some surprise to me, and I understand why though, that we don't have, word lists which are equivalent, say, to Michael West's General Service List, which was published in the early 1950s, and the research done on it in the 30s and 40s. But I still look around for a list which is better than that, and I don't easily find it.
I have a friend who's got a copy of that, and he swears by it. He says it's still fantastic.
It's great, yeah. I hope we can get it put up on the web as a publicly available document.
It's not now in print, is it?
No, it's not in print, and I've contacted the people who own the copyright, but I haven't had any response from them yet.
That's unfortunate.
But I think we'll get it up on the web, publicly available, probably within a year.
Okay, that's good news. I'd also like to ask you about testing. I'm thinking about large international tests or larger national-based tests. Are they getting it right or wrong?
No, I think we're getting better at testing. I think there's a growth in understanding that vocabulary knowledge is complex, like most knowledge, and there's also an understanding that vocabulary learning is a cumulative process, and therefore when we test learners, we sometimes should be using tests which give credit for partial knowledge rather than full strong knowledge, particularly when we do diagnostic tests and things like that. And so I think there is more sophistication growing and coming into the field. There are books now on testing vocabulary, which there weren't before. And so, I've generally got a positive view about these sorts of things. There are many more tests available. When I started off, there were no vocabulary tests for second language learners available at all. And now it's not hard to go and find at least half a dozen or more which are freely available and well researched. Yeah.
Well, you mentioned research, and you've mentioned a lot of research, and you do your own research, and you're quite involved in research into vocabulary.
Well, it's a major part of my job because I have a lot of PhD students who do a lot of my research. No, they do their own research, but it's in the areas of vocabulary. I also do research as well, and that's part of my job. And I think it's good because people are now publishing from their research much more.
But
I think that helps us.
Well, the thing about that is that I think I've seen you present before and seen you present today, and also seen your books as well. And it's not easy to get some of these ideas across to the teacher at the chalk face, should we say. Do you think that researchers are getting their messages across, and how could they do it better?
Well, yeah, I find it hard to see how we could do it better, but I'm sure there are ways to do it better. I think that, first of all, researchers have to do good research. There's no point in trying to get research across if it isn't good research. So the quality of research is very important. Secondly, some research doesn't directly relate to what teachers do, although it's an important justification for what they might be doing at the present time. But I think I'm always impressed when I go and talk to teachers' organisations, how many people there are coming to those talks. And they're coming in their own free time. They often have to pay their own conference fee, but they're coming along to try and get professional development. And so that's why I'm happy to come to events like the English ETJ Expos and to talk at JOLT and JASSET meetings and things like that, because I think these are places where people get research across. Also, I think that research should be put into articles which are easily accessible to teachers, and don't bury the research in findings and a lot of technical things which teachers are not really interested in. They want to know what to do. And so I see a need for publications which both are strongly research-based and describe research, but also ones which apply research.
Well, a lot of your material is available on your own website or staff page?
Yeah, I make all my articles available.
Yeah.
I'm probably breaking copyright doing it, but
But it's useful to have them around, I think.
yeah.
Okay, a couple of last questions then. One is, you talked a lot in the presentation that we just saw about how we need to plan and balance the vocabulary instruction. So you do think perhaps that we should be teaching vocabulary, not just teaching to learn vocabulary?
Oh, well, I think teaching vocabulary is the least important of the vocabulary teachers' jobs. And so, because there's so much vocab to learn, and you're never going to get through any respectable amount of it through class teaching. So that's why I tend to stress the jobs of planning and the jobs of assessing and the jobs of training learners in the use of strategies. So I wouldn't like to see vocabulary teaching being given too much emphasis, because I think a lot of good learning occurs, and probably the best learning occurs when teachers are not teaching. And so I think it's really important for a teacher to try and understand that. It's quite difficult to do that because teachers are conscientious and feel they have to earn their money, and so they should therefore be active in the classroom. But it's really important for the learners to be active rather than the teacher. So it's that's quite a hard one to get across. And yeah, it's always a battle, that one.
Okay. All right, and so the final question, Paul, what are you working on at the moment?
Oh, that's a good question. At the moment, I'm working more on research interests. I've just written a book with a colleague on researching vocabulary, and so I'm here in Japan teaching a course on researching vocabulary, which is a way of seeing if I have to revise the book and change it. I'm getting really useful feedback through doing that. I'm also working on books for teachers, particularly beginning teachers, because I think there's not enough directed towards teachers who have little formal training at all. And so I want to produce a book which deals with that gap. I'm still working on word lists and vocabulary tests, but they're like a black hole and they just keep sucking up my time all the time. So I don't know how much more I'll put into that.
Okay.
Okay.
All right, well, thank you very much for your time, Paul. It's been a pleasure.
No problem.
Thank you.
Thank you.